this class. There we go. So one nice thing about this class is that it's very much a basic overview of all the different types of food preservation. So we're not going to go too much in depth on any given technique, but we're going to be talking about just kind of some of the basics of each. And if you're interested in more information on any of them, you can feel free to ask questions at any time. You can always call or email me after the class as well. And then as part of the sign up for this class specifically, you will be getting a variety of pre-recorded classes on the canning topics as well that you can watch at your leisure. So you'll get the recording for this class as well as classes that I've taught in the past on jams and jellies, water bath canning, pressure canning, and pickling. So if any of those are of interest to you, you can check those out. You can watch them as many times as you'd like within 30 days. So they'll be good for 30 days after you receive an email after this class. So once we do complete this class, you'll receive a follow-up email, and that email will include the slides that we go over today. So you'll get the PowerPoint from today, everything that we go over. So if you want to take notes, you can, but just know that you will get a copy of all this information as well. We will also send out the slides for all of the other classes that you'll get a copy of. You'll get a link to all those classes, and then also just some other links to helpful resources, specifically some that we're going to reference today. So you'll have a copy of those. As far as questions go, you can feel free to ask questions at any time during the class. If you want to unmute yourself, you can certainly do that and just kind of interrupt me as we go. We're a pretty small group today, so that should work out just fine. You can also put questions in the chat, but I can't really see the chat while I'm in presenter mode. So if you put them in the chat, I will just be checking those at the end, and we can go through any questions in the chat at the very end of the presentation. And like I said, my contact information will be provided. So if you have any follow-up questions at any time, you can feel free to reach out to me later as well. All right, so with that, we will go ahead and get started. So like I said, this is going to be on the basics of food preservation. So we're going to be talking about 3 main methods of food preservation today. That will be freezing, dehydrating, and canning. And like I mentioned, this is very much an overview. Freezing and dehydrating are a little bit less complex overall. So we can cover most of the information on those two. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is when we get to canning. So this is very much a basic overview of canning specifically. But like I said, you will get those other pre-recorded classes that will go more in depth into different varieties of canning and different styles of canning. And if you have any additional questions, again, you can always reach out to me. So with that, we're going to start with freezing. So freezing is a preservation method that preserves the freshness of the food, the flavor of the food, the texture, as well as the nutrients. So freezing is a really good option. It's a really easy option for food preservation that really maintains the overall quality of the food. It works by bringing the temperature down to a degree that stops the growth of microorganisms or bacteria that can cause foodborne illness. And it's also going to slow down the enzyme activity. And enzymes, specifically in fruits and vegetables, are what cause the fruit and vegetables to ripen. But then eventually over time, they also cause those fruits and veggies to over-ripen and eventually start to decay and deteriorate and mold eventually. So we want to make sure that we are freezing things at the peak of ripeness to really preserve that freshness, flavor, and overall nutrients. So if we can get it at kind of that peak ripeness, that's where those enzymes are going to make them very ripe, very flavorful, very colorful. But before we get to that point where we start to see the decay occur. The biggest thing with freezing is that the pros, I guess, are that we don't need a lot of equipment for freezing. There's not a lot of equipment outside of the freezer. So it can be a pretty hefty initial investment if you don't have a lot of freezer space. You want to invest in possibly a chest freezer or an additional freezer for your basement or garage, something like that. That certainly is an upfront cost. But past that, we really just need our storage containers that we're going to use in the freezer. And we don't need a lot of equipment past that. And then, of course, we do have a small amount of energy that would go into running that freezer as well. As far as packaging goes, we have a few recommendations for freezing. Good choices are going to include things that are airtight, moisture and odor resistant, durable and leak proof, resistant to cracking, and easy to seal and label. So those are things we're going to look for is packaging for freezing. And a lot of times they make it very simple for you at the store. A lot of times they will basically say freezer safe or freezer storage right on the label. So there's freezer safe Tupperware containers, glass containers. There's also Ziploc bags and other brands of freezer bags, as well as freezer paper. Some things we would not recommend refreezing products in would be recycled plastic dairy containers. So those plastic containers that we find sour cream or yogurt in, those plastics are not very thick. They're not meant to hold up in the freezer for long periods of time under that extreme temperature. They're more for just a refrigerated product for a short amount of time. A lot of times they're very thin as well, so they can actually absorb different odors or different flavors from what was originally stored in them. So if we store something else in them later on, those odors and flavors can actually go back into our foods that we're storing in there. We would also not recommend using wax paper or any sort of cardboard or paper cartons for obvious reasons. They're just not going to hold up in the freezer over time. All right, so some information about headspace for freezing. So headspace is not only very important when we are canning products, but also when we are freezing. And the reason for that is that when we do freeze products, especially when they have any sort of liquid or pureed component to them, they're going to expand as they freeze. And so we want to make sure that we account for that, give that space in our container so that our container doesn't crack or explode or the lid come off or anything like that. So with freezing, it's always better to err on the side of a little extra headspace. It's not going to hurt anything. And again, it's going to ensure that our containers don't break or become over full or the lid come off or anything like that. But we have a little bit of flexibility. These are really just approximations. So you can kind of decide how big the opening of your container is and the size of your container, and just make sure that you're leaving approximately the correct amount of headspace. From a food safety standpoint, if you're a little bit off, it's not going to matter. Conversely, with the canning, the headspace is going to be needing to be a lot more exact. But with freezing, if we have a liquid, pureed, or crushed food, and we have a reasonably wide opening on our container, if it's about a pint size, we want to leave about a ½ inch of headspace. If it's about a quart size or a little bit larger, we want to leave more like an inch of headspace. If we have a more narrow opening on our container, so say we have a regular canning jar, a pint-sized jar, we'd want to leave a little bit more space for those narrow openings containers. So we'd leave about 3/4 of an inch for a pint size. Something a little bit larger, a quart size or larger, we'd want to leave about 1.5 inches. If we have a food that doesn't contain a large amount of liquid, then we can just go ahead and assume about a ½ inch for all containers will be fine. And finally, for tray packed foods, we don't need to account for any headspace because those will already be frozen previously. So with that tray packed foods, like I just mentioned, this is one way to freeze certain types of foods. So the tray pack method works really well for small whole fruits or vegetables or small cut up or diced fruits or vegetables. And all you're going to do is you're going to place those small whole or cut fruits and veggies in a single layer on either a shallow tray or a freezer safe plate of some sort, and just go ahead and pop that in the freezer for about 4 to 6 hours. Once those are totally frozen solid, then we can go ahead and remove them and place them into one of those freezer safe containers that we talked about for long-term storage. And we'll go ahead and put that back in the freezer. And because these are already individually frozen, we don't need to worry about headspace because they're not going to expand any further. But the advantage to the tray pack is that basically each of these pieces is going to be individually flash frozen before we combine them into a larger container. So if you're doing a large batch of something, it's really nice to have them a little bit individually frozen, because when you go to use them, they're not all stuck together in a giant block in the freezer. So you can more easily remove just a half a cup or a cup at a time and then place the rest back in the freezer. If you don't do the tray pack method and you just place them all in a container together and freeze them, they're going to freeze into a giant ice block or chunk. And in order to remove part of that, you're going to have to thaw the entire thing, remove that half cup or cup that you need, and then refreeze the rest. And that refreezing and thawing process over time is going to decrease our quality, flavor, and nutrients of that food. All right, so some specifics on freezing fruits. There's lots of different options for freezing fruits. So the first option we have is freezing in a syrup pack. So the syrup pack is going to be basically freezing your fruits in a concentration of water and sugar. And there's different concentrations of this ranging from light to heavy. And the sugar helps to preserve the flavor and texture and overall quality, but it's not necessary from a food safety aspect. Like with some of our canning goods, the sugar is part of the preservation process. So it's very important that we stick to the recipe and that we have that exact amount of sugar needed. With freezing, the temperature is really our preservation method. So the sugar is just an added bonus. So most recipes for freezing fruits will give you a recommendation on what concentration of syrup to use. And if you're using a tested recipe or something from an approved source, such as an extension website, those recipes have undergone testing to make sure that they are creating the best overall quality product. So depending on the type of fruit, it will give you a range of syrup options. And that, again, is just going to give you the overall best quality. But if you feel like that syrup is maybe a little bit too heavy or even too light for your liking, you can certainly change that up a little bit. So you can go a step lower or even a step higher, depending on your personal preferences. So that's the first option, the syrup pack. The second option is a sugar pack. So this is where we just place sugar directly over the fruit, and that helps to naturally draw out the fruit juice and create kind of a natural syrup without the addition of water. So with this, typically the syrup that's created is going to be a little bit less concentrated and a little bit less liquid overall, but that's another option. If you don't want to add any syrup to your fruit or sugar to your fruit, excuse me, you can do an unsweetened version. So you can always freeze your fruit in just water by itself. You can also use a fruit juice or an artificial sweetener. And then finally, our last freezing fruit option. Again, this is going to work best for our smaller fruits or cut up fruits or berries. And that's going to be the tray pack, where again, we're placing it on a tray, individually freezing them, and then placing them in another container for long-term storage. But I just wanted to show you guys an example of a recipe for freezing peaches. So this comes from a screenshot from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. They are a program run out of the University of Georgia Extension, And they have a lot of great resources on all things food preservation. So they have a lot of great tested recipes, as well as just information on how to perform all of these different food preservation processes. So they are a resource I highly recommend you checking out, and we will include a link to this website in our follow-up email. But basically, this is an example of one of their recipes, and I really like the way that it lays everything out because it gives you all the steps and all the options right in one place. So like I said, this is for freezing peaches or nectarines. And so you can see our first step is the preparation. So we want to select well-ripened fruit, sort, wash, and peel. And then we have different options depending on the type of pack that you would like to do. So we have a syrup pack option, we have a sugar pack option, and a crushed or pureed option. And like I was mentioning with the syrup pack, there's different concentrations of syrup. And so for this one, it recommends using a 40% syrup. And as you can see, that word syrup is green and underlined. So it has a hyperlink to the syrup table. So if you were to be on the website, you could click that and it would take you to this table here, which shows you the different types of syrups and the amount of sugar and water ratio for each of them. So for peaches, they are recommending a 40% syrup, which is considered heavy. And as you can see, that would be 2 3/4 cups of sugar to 4 cups of water. But again, if you feel like that might be a little heavy for you, you can always drop it down to a light or medium, which would be a 20% or 30%. Or if you like a really sweet peach recipe, you could bump it up to very heavy, up to 50%, which would be an equal ratio of sugar and water. All right, so some additional information on pre-treatments. So for fruit, a pre-treatment is going to help to prevent discoloration during the preparation and freezing process. So this is not a required step, but for a lot of our lighter colored fruits, we will likely see discoloration and specifically darkening if we don't do this. So it kind of depends on your personal preference, but it's going to create just an overall better looking product in the freezer. So there's a few options for pre-treatments for fruit. The first is going to be ascorbic acid, which is also known as vitamin C. So you can create a solution made with either a powdered form of vitamin C, or if you have vitamin C tablets or ascorbic acid tablets, you can crush those up into a powder and make a solution from that. Another option is a commercially prepared ascorbic acid mixture. So we see on this slide here, we have an example called Fruit Fresh. It's an ascorbic acid mixed with usually either dextrose or citric acid. And that will have instructions on the back of the label with how much to add and how to use it. For the ascorbic acid, we have information on that in our freezing fruit fact sheet. So depending on the type of fruit that you're pre-treating and how much, we recommend a certain ratio of that as well. So we'll send that fact sheet out as well with all of that information. Another option for the pre-treatment is citric acid by itself. Again, you'll make a solution with the crystalline form. Or finally, you can also use lemon juice mixed with water. But that is going to be our least effective option when compared with the citric acid and ascorbic acid. So typically, the ascorbic acid or that commercial ascorbic acid products such as Fruit Fresh are going to work the best. All right, so pre-treatment for vegetables is much more necessary than with fruits. So the blanching of vegetables is going to help in a variety of ways. First, it's going to slow or stop that enzyme activity. So again, making sure that we're not over-ripening our vegetables to the point that their quality starts to decrease. It helps to prevent loss of quality, color, flavor, and nutrients. It can also help to destroy some foodborne illness causing bacteria and remove any surface dirt that might still be on our veggies. And it can also help to soften our vegetables a little bit, making them easier to pack into containers, and making us be able to maximize our product per container. So we can fit a little bit more into each container if they're a little bit softer. And basically what blanching is it's just either boiling or steaming these vegetables for a short period of time. Again, each vegetable is going to have slightly different recommendations for blanching. And those specific recommendations can be found on our freezing vegetables fact sheet, which we will also send you a copy of. All right, so our last recommendation for freezing is actually freezing in ice cube trays. So you can use just these cheap plastic ice cube trays to freeze certain types of foods in. So the first thing that this works really well for is herbs. So if you have a fresh herb garden, or you go to the farmer's market and pick up a bunch of fresh herbs, or maybe even just the grocery store and you're having a hard time using them all before they start to go bad, freezing in ice cube trays can actually be a really good option. And essentially all you're going to do is either place whole leaves or chopped up leaves, kind of depending on how big the herbs are. And you're going to fill each ice cube tray about halfway full with those leaves. You're going to then fill the rest of it with water and try to submerge those herbs as much as possible. Then you're just going to go ahead and pop that ice cube tray in the freezer. Usually for about 8 hours or overnight is fine until they're totally frozen. And then again, we're going to go ahead and remove them from the ice cube tray and transfer them to either a freezer bag or freezer safe Tupperware, glass jar, something like that for long-term storage. And the frozen herbs can be used in a variety of ways. So you can use them as ice cubes themselves. So you can use these herb cubes to enhance the flavor in your water, lemonade, tea, things like that. But you can also use them in recipes. So if you have a soup or a stew recipe, or even a sauce recipe of some sort, and you have it going on the stove, you can go ahead and just pop one of those herbs or spices, ice cubes into your recipe as you're cooking. If you're really on top of it and you know that you have a mixture of herbs that you like to use in a recipe, you can combine those herbs into one cube. And then when you're ready to make it, using those fresh herbs that you've preserved in the summer, and you're making that sauce or soup or stew in the winter, you can go ahead and just throw one of those in and everything's already sort of pre-measured out. You can use them for different sauces as well. So you can freeze pesto sauce, tomato sauce, as well as fruit juice or fruit purees. So again, that fruit juice or fruit puree can be used to infuse water or different drinks, but can also be a really good option for smoothies as well. And then just some notes about labeling and storing frozen goods. So we always recommend labeling with the product name, so what it is, the date it was frozen, the quantity, if you have that measured out, and then any added ingredients. And we always want to make sure that they are frozen immediately and that your freezer is set at 0 degrees Fahrenheit or below. And freezing is a really good option to maintain high quality foods for long periods of time. So as long as nothing is disrupted within your freezer, this is going to maintain really high quality foods, not only in texture, but taste and nutrients as well, for about 12 to 18 months. So for 12 to 18 months, we're getting a really high quality product. After that, we do start to see that the quality can start to decline, but it doesn't mean that the product is unsafe. So it might not be top quality after 18 months, but it still is certainly safe to eat as long as we haven't had any power outages or issues with our freezer. Hopefully we haven't taken it out of the freezer and thawed it and refrozen it multiple times. Things like that will start to affect the quality in a faster amount of time. But overall, freezing is a really great option for someone who doesn't want to invest in a lot of complicated equipment. It's a very fast option as well. Prepping a lot of this food doesn't take very long. It doesn't take very much. The biggest thing is really just making that freezer space available. That can be a difficulty for some people. All right. So that's kind of our little introductory part to freezing. So next we are going to move on to dehydrating. So dehydrating is a preservation method that works by removing moisture so that microorganisms cannot grow and therefore spoil our food. Some of the pros to dehydrated foods is that they take up less storage space than with frozen or canned foods because they do become a lot smaller in volume as we dehydrate them. Another thing to note is that with dehydrated foods, when we remove that water content, the flavor becomes much more concentrated. So this can be kind of a good and bad thing, depending on what we're using it for. And there's a few different approved methods for dehydrating. So first we have use of a dehydrator. You can also dehydrate in your oven. And in specific cases, we can also use a microwave. So again, with the dehydrator, it doesn't involve a lot of equipment, but if you're looking to create the very best quality dehydrated goods, the investment in a dehydrator is highly recommended. It's just going to give us our very best quality foods under the most sanitary conditions. So it's creating a very food safe environment where airflow is controlled, temperature is controlled, time is controlled. It's just giving us the most control over how this food is dehydrated. And there's a wide variety of different dehydrators available on the market today. They range greatly in cost, size, and quality to a certain degree. So we see dehydrators anywhere from about $30 up until close to $300. So take this information today and kind of decide, how invested you might be in dehydrating foods and what type of dehydrator might work best for you if you're interested in purchasing one. But essentially, despite all the different brands and prices and everything, dehydrators fall into two main categories. And we can see them in these photos below. So all dehydrators fall into two categories, and those two categories have to do with where the fan is located on the dehydrator and the direction of the airflow. So this photo on the left, we can see has trays that pull out from the front of the dehydrator. And with this model, the fan is located in the back of the dehydrator. And as a result, the airflow is going to be horizontal throughout the machine. So this is going to be one of our higher quality but higher cost options. So these usually run anywhere from about $150 to $300 depending on the size that you get. And the nice thing about this is that each tray is getting the exact same amount of airflow. So you don't have to worry about rotating the trays. You don't have to worry about uneven drying. Everything is getting very consistent airflow and temperature the entire time. The downside to this is that there's an initial cost is going to be higher than some of our other models, as well as the size is not changeable. So if you purchase a 5-tray dehydrator, you can only do 5 trays at a time. They go up to 9 trays, I believe, for the most expensive if you want a really big one to be able to do really large batches. But again, that does come with a cost. The other option is this photo we see on the right. So we see that for this particular model, the fan is located in the base. Some models like this, we will see that it's located in the lid as well. But essentially the airflow is going to be vertical for these. So the downside is that not all trays are getting exactly the same amount of airflow and temperature. The trays closer to the fan are going to get higher airflow. So it is recommended that if you have one of these styles that you just rotate those trays periodically to try to eliminate any uneven drying. But the advantage to these are they're a lot less expensive. So I've seen them as low as $30 or $40. Certainly there's a lot of options in this range for under $100. And you can also add more trays if you'd like. So as you can see, this one has 3 trays on it right now, but you can add really as many as you'd like. Just keep in mind that the taller the stack, the less airflow those trays are getting that are further away from the fan. So we do want to make sure that we are rotating those trays to dry things as evenly as possible. And the further away from the fan, the longer that those foods will take to dry out. But those are the 2 main types of dehydrators. And again, this is just going to give you the very best quality of dehydrated product. Oven drying is an option for certain foods. The pros to oven drying is that there's really little or no investment in equipment. Probably all of us have an oven at home, so that's not really an issue. But it is important to consider the cost of energy used. Oven drying is not the most efficient option. So it typically takes about 2 to 3 times longer than a dehydrator. And dehydrating in general is not a super quick process. So if we're looking at our dehydrator, something might take 8 hours in the dehydrator. So with our oven, we're looking at close to 24 hours for some of those products. So we just have to keep in mind, the energy as well as safety factor involved with keeping our oven on for a full 24 hours. And we are not just leaving our oven on with the door shut. The door does need to be open about 2 to 4 inches for air circulation. We also want to make sure that we're rotating our food and our trays within the oven because again, we're not necessarily going to be getting completely even airflow throughout our oven. We're not setting our oven at a super high temperature. So, from a safety standpoint, it's not going to be set at 400 degrees for 24 hours straight. We're typically looking for a temperature of 140 to 145 degrees. Anything above that tends to start to scorch or cook our food. Some ovens actually don't go to temperatures this low. So before you try any sort of oven dehydrating, you might want to just double check that on your oven. But again, just some things to consider, leaving that oven on for a long period of time with the door open. You want to be mindful of children as well as pets. And just from a food safety standpoint, making sure that your kitchen is relatively clean. We do recommend if you have space that you can actually add a fan outside the oven door to add additional airflow as long as it's not on too high of a setting. But that will tend to blow any potential dust or dirt or dander in your kitchen around into your oven. So certainly is doable, but again, highly recommend the dehydrator option if you're going to be doing a lot of dehydrating. And then finally, we have our microwave option. So this is going to work for small quantities of herbs only. So we can't really use it for anything other than herbs. Herbs have a very small moisture content. They're very small. They're very easy to dry. Anything that's going to be more moist than that is going to be very difficult to do in a microwave, excuse me. But in order to microwave dry herbs, all you're going to do is take a microwave safe plate, place a paper towel over that. And then we're going to lay a single layer of those leaves, whether they're full leaves or chopped leaves, depending on the type of herb we have. And then we're going to place another paper towel over that and go ahead and pop it in the microwave for 1 minute. After that, we'll go ahead and remove it. We'll check to see if it's dry. I can tell you that it will not be, but we want to take another microwave safe plate over the top and go ahead and flip the whole thing over and remove that top plate. And again, place it in the microwave for 30 seconds to a minute. And then we're just going to repeat that process over and over until it's dry. So living here in Colorado, we have relatively low environmental moisture contents. And typically, depending on the herb and how many there are on the plate, this is going to take about 5 to 7 minutes of actual microwave time. But we want to make sure that we are giving it that break and flipping it over each 30 seconds to a minute to make sure that it's drying evenly and that we're not cooking it. So we want to let it cool in between. If we just place it in the microwave for 5 minutes, we're going to totally cook it, and it's not going to work as a dehydrated product. But that is an option if you have a microwave and you're just interested in drying herbs, then maybe, you don't need to invest in that full dehydrator. All right, so some food safety considerations with dehydration. The first is going to be case hardening. So case hardening occurs when we're dehydrating at too high of a temperature, and the drying process cannot be accelerated by increasing a temperature of the dehydrator or the oven. So dehydrating is really a low and slow process. So some people might think they can cheat the system a little bit by increasing the temperature of their oven or dehydrator, and maybe it'll take a little bit of time off the process, because a lot of these times really they are 8 to 12 hours or even longer. But what that does is it causes the outside of the food to dry or give the appearance that it's dry while leaving moisture on the inside that we can't see, which will later cause mold and spoilage and potentially foodborne illness. So we don't want that to happen. This is something that occurs frequently in sun or solar drying, just due to the lack of temperature control. So personally, we do not recommend using sun or solar drying for the purpose of drying anything that you plan to eat. You can certainly use sun or solar drying for, herbs or leaves or flowers or anything that you might want to use for ornamental purposes, or creating fragrant oils or anything like that. But if you're trying to consume these products as food, the sun or solar drying just creates too many potentially dangerous situations. So there is a way to test for dryness. If you're not sure if it's dry, it's always a good idea to condition your products before consuming them. So for testing for dryness, as a general rule, vegetables should be hard and brittle, whereas fruits should be more leathery and pliable. But the conditioning process is pretty much a surefire way to tell if there's still moisture in your food. All you're going to do is, after you dehydrate whatever food you have, you're going to place those dried foods loosely in a tightly closed container. So glass canning jars work really well for this because you can see right through them. They have a very well tight fitting lid. So you're just going to place them in that jar and tightly close the lid. And then every day for about 4 to 10 days, you just want to kind of gently shake or stir the contents of that jar. And after about a week, if you start to see beads of moisture forming or any sort of condensation in the jar, that's a clue that your food is not totally dry. If that happens, that's fine. You just want to return it to the dehydrator as quickly as possible and further process it for another, say, 4 hours or 8 hours, depending on the amount of moisture you're seeing. If, after a week to 10 days, you're not seeing any moisture coming off that jar, then we can go ahead and assume that that food is totally dry. And we can either leave it in that jar for storage, or you can transfer it into some sort of other storage container. All right, so some dehydrating examples. You can really use the dehydrator for a lot of different purposes. So it's great for different snacks. You can dehydrate all sorts of different fruits. You can make your own fruit leathers or fruit roll-ups. You can do different vegetable chips, including zucchini chips or kale chips. You can also make your own seasoning. So again, using those herbs as well as onions. You can also use it to dehydrate foods that you plan to rehydrate later. This can include tomato sauce, soups, or even casseroles. This is a really great option if any of you are into camping or backpacking or hiking in the backwoods. They make specific campers and backpackers dehydrated meals that are sold at a lot of the camping or outdoor stores, and they're very, very expensive. So making your own with your own dehydrator can be a really cost-effective option. And then finally, jerkies are a very popular thing to dehydrate. But with jerkies, we have a few safety caveats that we're going to talk about. So because we are dealing with meat in jerkies, we want to be especially cognizant of foodborne illness causing bacteria. But with jerkies, you can certainly make your own jerky. We just have a few recommendations in order to create a safe product. So with jerkies, you want to try to select a lean cut of meat. So you can use, really any type of cut. Round flank or chuck steaks are popular, as well as cross ribs, rump roasts, or even briskets. You can use beef that you purchase at the store. I know a lot of people who are hunters. They will use, whatever type of meat they have caught for the winter. And I've tasted a lot of different elk jerkies or moose jerkies or whatever it is. But with any type of meat, you want to try to make sure that it's lean, and if it's not, remove as much visible fat as you can. Because as we dehydrate fat, it can actually become rancid and spoil our whole product. We want to make sure that we are slicing our jerky pretty thin, so no thicker than 1/4 inch. If you can't get it that thin, you can use a rolling pin to kind of flatten it out even further. But one tip is to partially freeze your cut of meat before you slice it. And that just gives it a little bit firmer texture, and a lot of times it's a little bit easier to slice that way. And then if you've ever noticed, there's different textures to jerky sometimes. So if you have a preference, you can slice your cut of meat in a specific fashion, depending on the type of texture you like with your jerky. So if you like a chewier, softer jerky, we recommend slicing with the grain. But if you like a more tender, brittle jerky, you want to slice across the grain. And then there are two options for creating jerkies, and you do need to do one of these in order to ensure a safe product. So we have a hot pickle cure or a vinegar marinade option. And the reason that we need to do one of these two techniques is that the dehydrator does not reach a high enough temperature to kill all the potentially harmful bacteria, especially found on raw meat. So the dehydrator is really going to a maximum temperature of about 160 degrees, maybe 180, depending on the dehydrator. But that is not high enough to make sure that we kill all of those potentially foodborne illness causing bacteria. So our two options are to pre-cook the meat in a marinade and bring it to a boil, which will come to that temperature needed to kill off those harmful bacteria. Or we can soak it in a vinegar solution for 10 minutes. And the acidity of that vinegar will create an environment that those bacteria cannot survive in. So the first option, we call it the hot pickle cure. So we're going to start by creating a mixture of spices of 1.5 tablespoons of salt, 1 tablespoon of sugar, and 1 teaspoon of pepper. And we're going to rub or press that into our meat and refrigerate it for 24 hours. The next day, after those 24 hours, we're going to combine our ingredients for a brine, which will be 3/4 cup of salt, a 1/2 cup of sugar, 2 tablespoons of pepper, and 1 gallon of water. We're going to combine all those ingredients into a large stock pot, bring to a boil, and then place our strips of meat into that pot and simmer for 2 minutes each. So once they've simmered for 2 minutes, then you can go ahead and drain off that excess liquid or pat dry, place on our drying trays or our cookie sheets if you're using the oven, and continue with the dehydrating process. So that's the first option. The second option is a vinegar marinade. So this doesn't require any pre-cooking, but it does require the use of vinegar on your jerky. And some people absolutely love this recipe. If you like kind of that tangy flavor or that vinegar flavor, this is a really great option. Some people not so much. So either of these methods is going to work really well for creating a safe jerky product, but it's kind of up to you to decide which way you'd like to go. So with the vinegar marinade, we're going to place 2 cups of vinegars in a container or plastic bag and place our meat strips in there as well. And we're just going to soak it for 10 minutes. And then we can drain off that liquid. And then we're going to create an additional marinade that we're going to place in, again, a container or plastic bag with our meat strips and refrigerate for 24 hours. So after that 24 hours, again, we can drain off that liquid, pat dry, and place on our drying tray. And this is the recipe for that marinade. So it's going to be 1/4 cup of soy sauce, 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, 1/4 teaspoon of pepper, 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder, a 1/2 teaspoon of onion powder, and 1 teaspoon of hickory smoked salt. So I think together these flavors come out really nicely. But again, just keep in mind that it does have a hint of that vinegar flavor. So if you don't think you're going to like that, maybe the other option is better for you. All right, so that is our dehydrating process. And then finally, the last method of food preservation that we're going to talk about today is canning. And like I mentioned at the beginning, this portion is very brief and it's very, very much an overview. There's so much that goes into canning specifically, not only from a food safety standpoint, but also just an overall quality product standpoint, that it's really hard to cover in a short amount of time. So we're going to go over some very, very basics. And if you guys have additional questions, you can feel free to ask them today. You can feel free to call me or email me. And again, you will be getting copies of 4 additional canning specific classes. So where we spend an hour to 2 hours on each topic, and those topics will be the jams and jellies, the water bath canning, the pressure canning, and pickling. So those will go much more in depth on each of those topics. But essentially, to start, canning is broken down into 2 different methods, and the method that you're going to use depends on the pH of the food that you are trying to preserve. So first we have water bath canning, and this is going to be appropriate for acidic foods or foods with a pH of at least 4.6 or below. So this is going to include our fruits, our pickles, our jams and jellies, and tomatoes, as long as they are acidified. So tomatoes on their own are not necessarily considered an acidic food, but an acid source can be added to tomato recipes to make them acidic enough to water bath can. And that's usually in the form of either vinegar, citric acid, or lemon juice, depending on the recipe. The other type of canning is pressure canning. So this is going to be used for neutral or low acid foods. So with a pH of above that 4.6. So that is going to include our meat products, poultry, fish, and vegetables. So the difference between the two types of processes and that pH number of 4.6 is important in the prevention of botulism. So botulism in home canned foods can be deadly. It can be very serious. And it's something that is sometimes undetectable. So if you get a can of something from a neighbor or a friend, you're not going to be able to tell if it could potentially have been canned improperly or using the wrong type of canning, and could potentially make you really sick. The problem with botulism is it comes from the bacteria Clostridium botulinum. It's a bacteria that's found very commonly in nature, and the bacteria itself is not really the problem. But that bacteria forms spores. And those spores are extremely heat resistant. So we have to come up with a way to destroy those spores in order to create a safe product. With water bath can products, the spores can't survive, they can't germinate in acidic foods of pH of 4.6 or less. So that's where that 4.6 number becomes very important. So as long as our pH is below that 4.6, the spores can't survive naturally in those products. So we can water bath can those products, and that temperature of the water bath can is going to be high enough to kill pretty much all of our other foodborne illness causing bacterias, and we don't have to worry about that risk of botulism. The problem comes with foods that we can't get to that acidic environment. So because they can survive in a low acid foods, or basic food with the pH of 4.6 or above, we have to somehow destroy them in another way. And because they're very heat stable and heat resistant, we have to have an extremely high temperature in order to kill them. So that temperature is 240 degrees Fahrenheit or above. And so water bath canning or boiling our jars alone is not going to reach that temperature. But with the added pressure of the pressure canner, that will increase our temperature inside of our canner to above that 240, and thus destroying those spores formed by the Clostridium botulinum bacteria. So pressure canner, it has to be used for those low acid foods. There's just no other way to ensure that we get rid of those spores. All right, so some processes not recommended for canning. There are a lot of resources on canning on the internet, on blogs, on YouTube, and there's a lot of misinformation out there, to be honest. So these are some recommendations for what not to do. The first is open kettle canning. So a lot of people claim that you can do this. Essentially, what you're doing is you're filling your jars with a boiling hot food from the stove, and then just placing the lid directly on top of the jar. Sometimes you leave it, sometimes you flip it upside down, and the heat from the food inside the jar causes the seal to seal on top of the jar. But temperatures obtained in this method are not high enough to destroy all potentially foodborne illness causing bacteria or microorganisms and spoilage. So it can create an unsafe product. Next, we have oven, microwave, and dishwasher processing. So again, you can find recipes and suggestions on how to can in your oven, in your microwave, even in your dishwasher. But none of these have been tested, and they do not prevent the risk of spoilage organisms in your food. The next is using an electric power pressure cooker. So pressure cookers have become really popular in the last few years. The Ninja brand, Instant Pot, things like that. And a lot of them claim that they are, a 2-in-1 machine or 3-in-1 machine or even 10-in-1, and that they can be used as a pressure canner. A lot of them even come with recipes to be used to can. but the USDA does not recommend using pressure cookers as canners. They do not consider them canners based on their standards for what they consider a pressure canner to need to have in order to create a safe product. Additionally, none of these products that come with recipes, the recipes have not been altitude adjusted and they have not been tested at altitude. So especially important living in Colorado, there could be serious consequences to using those recipes at altitude. Some additional processes that would not be recommended would be paraffin or wax seals. So I know this one is very popularly used a lot of times. People think it's kind of a shortcut because you don't actually have to water bath can your products. You just heat wax up on the stove and pour it over the top of your jar, and it theoretically seals your jar. But the wax is never going to be airtight, and it doesn't seal completely in a lot of cases. So that allows for contamination, for mold to grow, for bacteria to grow, and potentially dangerous situation. And then finally, we have glass and zinc caps and Tattler lids. So these are different varieties of reusable lids. So a lot of people think they're being environmentally friendly by, having reusable lids. But there's not a lot of research out there about these. They can be very, very difficult to get to seal, and they can be very difficult to tell if they're sealed properly. So we would recommend just reinvesting in the single-use lids each year. It's a very small amount of waste, and it's a very small amount of cost associated with that to ensure that your food is going to be properly sealed and safe for that year or longer that it sits on your shelf. All right, so some steps to successful canning. We have 4 basic steps for any type of canning that you are doing. So first, we have review a tested recipe and instructions. So we always want to make sure that we are using a safe, up-to-date tested recipe, and that those instructions come from a reliable source. So essentially, a tested recipe means that it has undergone research at either a certified food lab or some sort of research institution. So we have a certified food lab on campus at CSU where they develop recipes. There are also food labs all across the country at other research-based universities, as well as certified food labs. A lot of them are sponsored by some of the canning companies. So Ball is a really big one that they create different recipes and recipe books that are available as well. These are a few recommendations for tested, safe recipes. The first is going to be through us at CSU Extension. So we have a variety of recipes on our website. We also recently launched an app called Preserve Smart. So this is available on your smartphone or tablet, as well as your desktop computer. And this has a variety of recipes on all things food preservation. So that's a really nice option if you're looking for something on your phone or tablet, especially. And the nice thing about the Preserve Smart app is you can enter your altitude, and it will go ahead and altitude adjust all the recipes for you. The National Center for Home Food Preservation is another great resource. I know I plugged this one earlier when we were talking about freezing, but it is also a great resource for all things canning as well. And then some of the recipe books we would recommend would be the So Easy to Preserve, the Ball Blue Book, the Complete Book of Home Preserving, and the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. All right, so step 2 for successful canning is going to be to plan time for canning. So canning certainly is not a quick process. It typically is going to take more time and energy than some of our other food preservation methods. So just knowing that up front is important in order to make sure that you prepare accordingly and that you have plenty of time to make sure that everything goes smoothly, and that you have plenty of time for preparation as well as the preservation process. Several of, especially the pressure canning recipes, The canning process alone is going to be, over an hour for just processing time alone. So you want to make sure that you have a dedicated amount of time to really prep your food, prep your jars, load your canner, and then go through that processing time as well. Number 3 is going to be select fresh ingredients. So with any preservation method, our preservation is going to be a little bit hard on our foods. So we're putting our foods under some sort of extreme condition, whether that be extreme temperature change or pressure, or heat or air or whatever it is. So by choosing fruits and vegetables and meats at the peak of freshness and ripeness, we're going to create our best quality preserved food as well. With fruits and vegetables, we want to rinse them, but we don't want to soak them. Peel if appropriate. And then again, we want to make sure that our meats are fresh, coming from a healthy source, and should be chilled and canned as quickly as possible. And then our final step before we get into, whatever we're canning is to assemble our equipment. So this is just a basic list of what you'll need. So depending on the type of canning you're doing, you're going to need either a pressure canner or a water bath canner. There are specific water bath canners out there. This is pretty much the basic model that you're seeing here in this photo. But you don't have to have a specific water bath canner. You can water bath can in a large pot as long as it's tall enough to fill with 1 to 2 inches of water above the top of the jars. So if you're doing smaller jars, you don't need quite as large of a pot. But if you're doing quarts or something like that, you are going to need a pretty good sized pot. And it should also have a well-fitting lid. You'll also need jars and lids. So the jars you can reuse as many times as they stay in good condition. So every time you get your jars out, you want to make sure that they're clean and just check them over to make sure that there's no cracks or breaks, no chips in the top or anything like that. And then those can be reused time and time again. The lids, like we talked about, they're going to be single use. So once we put the lid on and it seals, and we open that jar, that lid will no longer be used again. Same thing with the screw bands. So the metal screw bands that we see in that picture that are gold, those can be reused as long as they're in good condition. So again, just take a look at them, make sure there's not any dents or chips in them and that they're not starting to rust or anything like that. And then those can be reused as well. And then some canning specific equipment that you'll need. First, we have a jar lifter. And so that's in the lower left-hand corner of our photo. And essentially it has a handle on one side and rubber grips on the other side. And those rubber grips are going to help us to grip our jars when we're taking them in and out of the canner. So that's going to just help to transfer the jars into the boiling pot of water, and then also removing them safely when they're not only is the canner hot, but the contents of the jar will be hot as well. The next item is a lid wand. So that's that little blue piece of plastic with the black dot on the bottom. And it's basically just a piece of plastic with a magnet on the bottom. And that magnet helps us to grab the lid of each jar before we place it on the jar. So it helps us to just grab the lid and not touch the bottom of it. So we're not contaminating the lid with any particle of any kind that could possibly cause our jars not to seal. The next item is a bubble freer, which is just that sort of clear plastic piece we see there. It looks basically like a spatula, a small spatula, and you can use a small spatula or even the back of a butter knife or a spoon. But essentially what this does is it's used mostly in pressure canning and water bath canning, but you're just going to place it along the outer edge of your jar once it's loaded with food. and you're going to kind of agitate that liquid or brine to remove any air bubbles that might be trapped in the jar. And so those bubbles will be freed and moved to the top of the jar and eliminated before we process it. And then finally, we have a funnel. So this funnel in particular is really nice because it fits directly on top of canning jars. So it's the proper size, just kind of helps to funnel things into the jars, whether that be your jam or jelly or, you know, a brine of some sort for pickles or anything like that. Just kind of helps to contain the mess, especially with jams and jellies. Things can get pretty messy and they can get pretty sticky. So the funnel is a nice option there, but certainly not necessary. But those 4 pieces there, the jar lifter, the lid wand, the bubble freer, and the funnel usually come in a 4-pack. So you can kind of purchase that all together for not too expensive. So if you're going to be doing a lot of canning, I definitely recommend purchasing those equipments. And then essentially you're just going to need basic kitchen equipment for the rest of it. It depends a little bit on your specific recipe and what you're canning, but you're going to need a timer or your cell phone for that. And then just other things such as cutting boards, knives, measuring cups, spoons, things like that. All right, and then a final word about altitude adjustments. So it's very important that we here in Colorado are making proper altitude adjustments to create a safe can product. So for water bath canning, we need to add time to our processing time since water boils at a lower temperature as elevation increases. For pressure canning, we have to increase the pressure since atmospheric pressure gets lower as elevation increases. So that's one way to tell if you're looking at a tested or, you know, safe, secure recipe. They should have altitude adjustments on them. A lot of the things you'll find online, they will just have a processing time on them, and you don't know if that's for sea level, if that's for altitude or elevation, and how to properly adjust for that. So it's important to know your exact elevation for where you will be canning in order to make proper adjustments. If you don't know your elevation, you can go to resources such as whatismyelevation.com or geoplaner.com and put in your actual address, and it will give you your exact elevation. Most of the recipes are going to be a range, so you don't need to know the exact elevation, but pretty close. So this is, again, another recipe example from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. This happens to be for canning apple juice. And this is just another good example of how to read the recipe. And again, I think they do a really nice job of giving you all the information in one page. So it gives you the procedure of how to load your jars, create your product, and then your processing information in this table below. So you can go to the style of pack will be hot. You're going to hot pack your apple juice. And then depending on the jar size and your altitude, you can match what your processing time is going to be. So for us here in Pueblo County, we're at about 4,600 feet. So for pints or quarts, we would be looking at a processing time of 10 minutes. For half gallons, we're looking at a processing time of 15 minutes. If we're above 6,000 feet, then we're adding 5 minutes to each of those. So for pints or quarts, we're looking at 15 minutes. And for half gallons, we're looking at 20 minutes. In some cases, such as the recipe books that we talked about earlier, they're not going to have altitude adjustments on each individual recipe, but all of their recipes are going to be set at sea level, and then they'll provide a table such as this in either the front or the back of the book. But a typical rule of thumb is approximately 0 to 1,000 feet is considered sea level, and the processing time would be as it is in the recipe book. For 1 to 3,000 feet, you'll add 5 minutes for 3,000 to 6,000 feet. You'll add 10 minutes for 6,000 to 8,000 feet, 15, and 8 to 10. You'll add 20 from that original processing time. Same thing with the pressure canning, only you're adding pounds of pressure. So there's two different types of pressure canners, which are the weighted gauge and the dial gauge. And with the weighted gauge, you can only set your pressure to 3 different pounds of pressure, 5, 10, or 15. So with that, we see anything above our sea level, which is 0 to 1,000, we have to go straight to 15. With the dial gauge, we have a little bit more flexibility. And so for 1,000 to 2,000 feet, we'd have 11, for 2 to 4, 12, 4 to 6, 13 pounds of pressure, 6 to 8,000 feet, 14, and then finally 8 to 10,000 feet, we'd be at 15 pounds of pressure. But just make sure that you are reading your recipe and reading those altitude adjustments correctly, because they will change a little bit from recipe to recipe. But you should be seeing either something like we saw with the altitude adjustments directly on the recipe, or you need to be looking for some sort of table that looks something like this, and matching that with your proper altitude. All right, so with that, I will take any questions that you guys have. I don't think I saw anything go up in the chat. But here is my information as well. And again, you'll get all these slides as well as my information. So if you have any questions later, you can always give me a call or send me an email. And again, I know that was really quick, especially on the canning portion, but you will be getting those additional resources that'll go much more in depth on making jams and jellies, specifically water bath canning, pressure canning, and pickling. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. If not, I hope you all have a really great day.
Hello.
Yes.
I was at a farm store recently and was talking to the person there about making pickles. She said if you want to have crispy pickles, don't do the boiling water bath. She said just put the brine in there, and then make that boiling, put that in there, and then put the lids on and basically leave it at that.
So that would be an option for what we call refrigerator pickles. They shouldn't be left out at room temperature if they're not processed in a water bath canner though. But there is an option for refrigerator pickle recipes, and we do talk about that in the pickling class, where basically you go through the same exact process, and then you just put the lid on and you put them in the refrigerator. So yes, that is an option, but they should be refrigerated and not left at room temperature.
But the hot brine that you're pickling brine that you're pouring into them or over them is sufficient to take care of that.
Correct. So that would be like the open kettle canning process that we talked about that we would not recommend.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Anybody else got any questions? Well, like I said, thank you all for joining us today, and you will be getting a follow-up with all of those resources. So definitely take advantage of that, watch those other classes, and let me know if you have any additional questions after that. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye, Laura.
Bye, Brenda.